Okay, so welcome to Operations Research. This is lecture 13, Introduction to Integer Programming. So we've talked about how to do the simplex method, which allows us to solve when we have canonical linear programming problem where the variables are real. And we talked about how without loss of generality, we can adjust things so that all the variables are non-negative. With extremely high probability, we're going to have AX equals B, where B cannot be written as a combination of fewer than m columns of A. That is a bit of an assumption. We discussed the method of the simplex method. We did not prove that it runs efficiently. Most of the time it does run efficiently. There are occasionally some bad configurations. So there are other algorithms people have developed over the subsequent years. One of the other things to mention for the standard canonical programming problem is we have a linear constraint. And so the question is, well, what else could we do? So it turns out you can often handle various quadratic constraints. And we might talk a little bit about that later in the semester. You cannot handle quadratic objective functions. Sorry, you can handle quadratic objective functions. You cannot handle quadratic constraints. And I will show you later in the semester that if you could handle quadratic constraints, you could actually solve things like the traveling salesman problem very quickly. And so because of that, it gives you some sense of just how hard the subject is going to be, or relatedly, how hard integer programming can be. So integer programming is very similar to real programming, except instead of having the x's being non-negative numbers, what are we going to assume about the x's now? That they're integers. Can we assume that they're positive integers? Is that a loss? What do you think? Yes, so in the original canonical programming problem, we saw that we could adjust things to make the variables non-negative. If necessary, just put in something else. Write any variable as x minus y, where x and y are real and non-negative, and that will give you any real number, even a negative number. So without loss of generality, we can also assume, if we want to, that our inputs are non-negative. As long as everything is bounded, just write them as a huge negative number plus some positive amount, and you'll be fine. Frequently, we are going to have binary integer programming problems. So in binary, the variables will be either a 0 or a 1. Can somebody give me a good example of a binary indicator, a binary variable? On or off. So give me an example of some kind of problem in the real world where I'm going to assign maybe a value of 1 if it's on or 0 if it's off.
Like the lights in the building.
Sure. So I'm trying to calculate, what is the cost of running the building? And if the light is on or the heat is on, it's a 1. If it's not on, it's a 0. I don't know if we still do this, but I know for several years, Williams actually shut down a lot of buildings, including faculty offices, over the winter. It's winter break. Most people aren't going to be in their offices. So why should we be spending time and energy heating the buildings? And we could actually save a sizable amount of money. So a lot of things can be put into 1, 0. I am going to be flying later today. So your really good indicator variable is, has the plane left city I for city J at time t? And it's 1 if the answer is yes, 0 if the answer is no. So what I'm going to do today is talk about some work I did years ago back when I was in grad school. And this all came about because when I was an undergraduate, there was the used book exchange at Yale, and they had a wonderful book, and it's the book that my textbook is based off of, for $3. For $3, a hardcover Springer book, sure, I'll spend the $3. And it was just a beautiful introduction. This was Joel Franklin's, Mathematical Methods of Economics, an absolutely brilliant exposition on linear programming and a bunch of other problems. And so when I was, dating my wife back in grad school, she was, a graduate student at UPenn, and she had some professors who were working on problems for the movie industry. And so I was, very interested both as somebody who likes movies and somebody who likes mathematics. And so we started chatting. And so we ended up writing, a paper, and I'll put some links to it. There's a lot of components that go into, trying to do the analysis. So when you're trying to figure out what movies to show, the first thing you need to understand is, how do movie theaters make money? So how do you think movie theaters make money? Movie snacks, concessions, that reasonably priced popcorn and soda. How else do movie theaters make money? So one is the concessions revenue. How else? There's a really obvious thing you're missing. Tickets, right? Selling tickets to movies. So a lot of times, movie theaters do not choose to show certain new releases because the contracts are too expensive and they feel we're not going to get enough money. So frequently the contracts are such that the movie theater gets a higher percent of the revenue the longer the movie's been out. Well, the longer the movie's been out, most of the time, the lower the demand is. Most movies have almost like an exponential decay over time for demand. There are some movies that are the sleeper hits. They start off small, then word of mouth spreads. Movie theaters love something like that. So the movie theater has to decide. Do not worry about being politically correct. What kind of customer do you think the movie theater wants the most? What demographic? Okay, what age? Yeah, maybe teenagers, younger, people going out on a date, people hanging out with friends, more likely to be buying concession stuff. But of course, what do you have to do after you have a movie where you have kids? Clean up. And so you might have more cleanup costs. And so there's a lot of different factors that movie theaters have to take into account. And so this was a two-stage process. So before I joined, they had already come up with a linear programming way to help the theaters determine what movies should they buy during the week. And then the next stage, which is where I joined, was to try to figure out what time and on what screen should we show each movie. And so what I want to do today is I want to start talking about how we would come up with constraints and just really go through a problem, real world applications. How would we set this up? Okay. And we're going to have two types of constraints. I will call them hard constraints and soft constraints. A hard constraint must be satisfied. If you do not satisfy this, this is not allowed. A soft constraint is something that's desirable. So can you give me any hard constraints about your course selection at Williams? Good, so you have some course diversity that's required. What else? I'm assuming this is not everyone's only class. You have to have 4 classes a semester, and I believe you have to have eight semesters in residence. I'm not positive you can do it in 7. But there's a lot of different requirements. If you're going to be majoring in certain departments, and if you're majoring in math, you have to take real and abstract. You have to take a certain number of 300 level classes outside of real and abstract. But which ones you take, you have some freedom there. So you might have some schedules where you have some desirability. I would like to have at least one in everything like this. Okay, that's the ideal world. What are you willing to trade? And so it might be that if you want to take all the math classes you want, this would mean you can't take any classes in computer science or physics or art history. And so you might have, I want to try to find a schedule of courses that will allow me to do the following. But if I can't do, operations research, my life will not be over. I'll take something else instead. This is a class I want to take, but it's not a class that I absolutely must take. So when you're designing schedules, you will have a lot of classes that you would like to work in, but if you don't work it in, it's not the end of the world. Okay, so does everybody understand the difference between a hard constraint and a soft constraint? So when we get to the movie schedule, I will eventually talk about a constraint which was initially a hard constraint from the manager of the movie theater. And when we told him how much more money he could make if he turned it to a soft constraint, it's like, oh, well, I never meant you had to do that. It was just how much money? And so, a lot of times what you think you have to do, you don't. it's desirable, but if you're given enough, you will absolutely make some trades. So does anybody, let's try to think of what our variables should be. So we need variables for the movie problem. So let's say we have screens 1, 2, ... capital S. We have movies 1, 2, ... capital M. We have time slots 1, 2, ... capital T. Okay. Any other things you think we really need? And then X SMT will be 1 if on screen S start movie M at time T and 0 otherwise. So I think that's a really good variable. It indicates, have I started a movie on a certain screen at a certain time? So what other information do you think we'll need to know if we're going to solve this problem? Think of anything that might be important for solving this problem. What else might we need? So if you're going to design a schedule to tell me what movies to show on what screens at what time, what do you need to know? So we need to know the demand for the movie as a function of what? So this is the simple model, and I had some discussions with my colleagues about this. If you have Spider-Man playing at the same time as Bridget Jones' Diary, do you think they're going to be competing with each other a lot for demand? What if Spider-Man and Batman are playing at the same time? So it could be the case that there's a certain demand for certain genres of movies at a certain time of day. And if you have 2 similar movies playing, they might actually be competing with each other. The simpler case is to assume that each movie has a demand independent. So let's see the inputs. Demand for movie M at time T is, let's call it DMT, for the demand for the movie at time T. I'm always going to try to keep my subscripts in the same order, SMT. I probably should have done maybe MTS to do it in alphabetical order. But all right, so we need to know, what is the demand for movie? What else might we need to know if we're going to do some scheduling? So what else do you need to know about the theater? Capacity. So we need to know the screen capacity. So capacity for screen S is C sub S. What else do we need to know? Something really important if you're scheduling movies that you need to know about each movie. Length. Now, how do you want to define the length of a movie? So, well, I mean, we'll do it in terms of our time steps. But there's 2 ways you can define length of the movie. It's just the length to run, or it's the length plus the cleanup time. And then it could be the case that movies have different cleanup times at different times of day. That maybe if I'm showing a movie during prime time when I have lots of young kids, it'll take longer to clean up than if I'm showing it, really early in the day when the kids are in school and it's more elderly people coming. Let's keep things simple and let's just have runtime fixed. Runtime of movie M is R sub M. And that's going to be in time units. Okay. Anything else you can think of that we need to know? So we've got screen capacity now, which is great. We've got demand. And of course, the question becomes, how do you estimate demand? So that was another project that this built on, is one of the graduate students of one of the professors worked on coming up with models to estimate movie demand. And what you do is you try to compare, this movie to other movies that have come out and say, okay, here's a bunch of axes, and let's try to get some values of different parameters. Does this have well-known stars? Is it a sequel? Lots of different things you can look at, and you can do a reasonably good job of estimating what demands for movies will be. Right. Is there anything else we can think of that we need to know? So we talked about the two ways movies make money. So the question is, for concession revenue, does that depend on the movie? And thus, would certain movies bring us more money than others? So we would need some way to take into account that different movies will generate different hits in the concession stand. The simple model would be just all movies generate the same revenue, in terms of sales. But when you're trying to decide, that's not a reasonable assumption. What letter should we use? We've already used R. We've already used C. I don't want to use M because we've used M. We can't use S for sales. P, I was thinking P for purchases. Can't say profit. So I was thinking purchases. So purchases from movie M. And now we've got to think about what is the purchase going to be?
Would you bump it ticket sales, like model it as a function of like how the capacity? I guess like
okay, so the question is for ticket sales, do all movies cost the same to see? So who's actually been to a movie theater?
not in a while.
Sometimes they have like the 3D movies, and those might cost a little bit more. So they might have like the 3D version of Star Wars versus the regular version of Star Wars. So in a situation like that, you would have different ticket prices. And so we can do the purchase for movie M is this PM, and maybe this is per person. And then we need the ticket price per movie. So what letters should we use for ticket price? Ticket, stub, nope, that doesn't work. B for billet, is that ticket in some languages?
We're about A for admittance.
Admittance. There we go. Admittance revenue from movie M is A sub M per person. So do you think it's constant throughout the time of day? Or do you think ticket prices? No. So this should be really AMT. And what about the purchase? Do you think that should be dependent on time of day?
Probably.
Probably. So when in doubt, always put in time subscripts and whatnot. We're just setting things up. The more subscripts you have, the more data you need to input into your model. When my father was getting his MBA, he took a class from a really theoretical professor, I'm going to share the story, who gave them an equation with 46 variables on what to do. And my father is, of course, a very respectful person. And controlling his tone, he asks, well, I don't even know the values of a lot of these parameters for my own company, let alone for my competition. How can I use this formula? And isn't it a beautiful formula? Yes, it's a beautiful formula. And so when you start putting things together, you have to ask, is this information we can gather? How would you gather information about purchases for movies or admittance? Well, okay, admittance, that's easy. We're setting that as a theater. I have no concerns about being able to get the admittance. What about runtime for movie? I can do that easily. I'm not worried about that. And we'll say this. We could, if we wanted to, put a subscript T to say that the runtime depends on time of day, that certain movies might have more cleanup later. As a rule of thumb, again, not so bad. The capacity for the screen. Do you think the screen capacity is going to change? Probably not. Has anybody ever been in TBL 211 here? This is one of a few rooms on campus where you actually have a partition that you can put between two halves and you can actually split and adjust. Or a lot of synagogues or churches have this ability to change how many seats there are for certain key service states. And so there are potentially sometimes when you might be able to change capacity. Let's just assume capacity is fixed. The purchasing for movie M, that's going to be a tough thing to estimate. How do you think a movie theater might get data for that? So how might you get data for what the purchases from a movie M is?
You could look in like the trash can after the movie is over and see what people consume.
Okay, but this is better than looking in the trash can. Cash register, right? Years ago, one of my wife's cousins was getting married. And so for the bachelor party, we just went to a Brockton Rocks game to watch. And one of the old Red Sox, pitchers, Oil Can Boyd, Sally pitched the day before. We just missed him. And so since we were treating him, I asked him at one point, do you want anything? He says, love a pretzel. I'll get you a pretzel. I go, and it is the longest line I think I've ever seen. And it's moving very slowly. And I finally get to the front of the line. And I find out why it's moving so slowly. There's paper on the counter. And every time they make a sale, they're writing down on the piece of paper what they sold. And they're constantly updating the little piece of paper. And as a mathematician, I can't stay quiet in a situation like this. I said, can't you just get this information from the cash register, from just the transactions? Or if you need to do this, every sheet of pretzels you get has the same number of pretzels. Just record how many sheets you have. And then at the end of the day, you can adjust by the last one. I was, I think, speaking another language to them. And they slowed down the line tremendously because of how they were gathering their data. And when I went back, I said, Larry, here's your pretzel, and that's it for me, I'm out. I'm not going back in that line. And so this, I'm sharing this story because I want you to get real life lessons from this class. The data of what is the concession revenue is extremely important. They gathered the data in such a way that I think it depressed revenue. The line was so long, people gave up. If it wasn't his bachelor party and I wasn't taking him out, I would have screw this. I'm not waiting in line for this. But I said, I would get you a pretzel. I will get you a pretzel. But a lot of people just bailed on the line. So you want to think, how hard is it for you to gather the data? And how accurately do you need the data? Can you do some easy collections? Does anybody remember the picture of Cam and Kayla early in the book? So this is a picture of them. We're in Disney, and I love making things business expenses, but even I thought this was too much to make a business expense. And so when we were going on one of the rides, they actually gave us a red card. No, we were not doing anything illegal in soccer. They wanted to know how long it would take to get from certain points to the front of the line. So every now and then they just give somebody a red card. And they know when you get the red card, they scan it. And then when you get to the front of the line, they scan it. And then they now know, when red card 23618 entered, it took 28 minutes for them to get to the front. And that's how they can constantly update very easily. The expected wait from this part of the line to the front is the following. Absolutely brilliant, a very simple thing to do. It's not that user intense, doesn't really affect the experience, but it gets them the data they need in almost real time. Wonderful, absolutely wonderful idea. All right, so are we all good on the variables we're going to have? The variables is basically, are we showing a movie or not? I really can't think of any other variables that matter. Are we showing a movie? Now we have to choose constraints. Before we choose constraints, can somebody give me a schedule of movies that will satisfy the constraints? No movies, right? I don't even have to tell you what the constraints are. Showing no movies is clearly going to work. Okay, so now the question is, can you start giving me some of the constraints? So what do you think might be reasonable constraints? And say it in English. And then we'll try to convert it to math. What would be a constraint? You own a movie theater. What is a hard constraint that must be true?
One movie per screen at a time.
One movie per screen at a time. Now, oh God, I'll risk asking this. I'm assuming nobody here saw Phantom Menace when it came out in the theaters. But everyone is too young for this. So George Lucas was powerful enough that he could say, hey, look, if you're going to show Phantom Menace, you've got to show it on your biggest screen. Your sound system must be at least at a certain level, or you'll not be able to appreciate Jar Jar Binks. Some theaters said it's not worth it. Others said absolutely happy to do it. And some theaters actually showed 2 copies of Phantom Menace. So they would actually buy multiple copies. So in a situation like this, you could have copy 1, copy 2 of a movie. And so you can't show the same copy on 2 different screens at the same time, but you could show 2 copies. Now, what is the difficulty if you have 2 copies of the same movie? What could be a challenge if you have 2 copies? If you go back to our constraints and the things we're trying to figure out, we've got the demand. The first one is the demand for movie at time t. If we have 2 copies of the same movie, they can easily be competing with each other for the same demand. All right, so the first constraint is cannot show one movie on, how did you want to say it?
Cannot show more than one movie on the same screen.
Okay, cannot show more than one movie on a screen at a given time. So let's convert this to math speak. So this has got to be true for any screen, right? So if it's true for any screens, for all S in S. So I'm going to use a little bit of abusive notation. This will mean the screens 1 all the way up to S. So I'll try to make it like a fancy S. And then for all T in time, right? So we're going to get a constraint for every screen and for every time. And now we want to make sure that we don't have multiple movies playing on this screen at this time. So how do we determine if a movie is playing on this screen at this time? What would have had to happen if we were playing this movie at the screen at this time? Which X? Okay, so if X SMT is 1, then we just started it at that time. How else could it still be playing at that time? Within the runtime. And now you go back and say, oh, wait a minute, if the runtime depends on the time, this is going to get a little bit harder. Because we then have to worry about when we could have started it. So let's make things simpler. And just, let's assume for now that the runtime only depends on the movie, that it doesn't depend on time of day. Okay? Again, you can easily handle stuff like this, but let's just try to keep it a little bit cleaner. So if I want the movie to be playing at a certain time, I look for every movie. So M goes from 1 to M. I know the screen and I know the time. And then I would look at a sum. Tau goes from 0 to, this is where I always hate things. So I look at the runtime of the movie. And so if the runtime of the movie is 1 unit and I started it 1 unit ago, it would have finished and it would not be running. So I think it's RM minus 1. Okay. And then I look at X, the screen S, the movie M, and the time tau. And I look at that sum. So this sum is 1 if movie starts in enough time to be running at time t. And so for each movie, I check and make sure that I have not started too many movies in the past. Now, of course, one possibility is, imagine my theater opens at 12 o'clock. So we'll call 12 o'clock time 0. Technically, I might actually be looking at maybe, did I start the movie at 11:30? Well, we'll just define all of our variables to be 0 if the movie is, if it's before the theater opens, right? You know, I could technically, because I'm going backwards in time. Oh, so wait a minute. It should be the time script should be not tau. It should be t minus tau, right? Because when tau equals 0, we're starting the movie at time t. When tau equals 1, we started it 1 unit ago. When tau equals 2, we started it 2 units ago. What do you think a reasonable unit for time would be? How many minutes?
90 minutes.
So, well, I'm saying, so we would be doing things in 90-minute increments. I'm breaking my day up into time 1, time 2, time 3, time 4. I could have all the times be just 1 minute, but the more time steps I have, the more variables I have, the harder the program is going to be to solve. What do you think a good clump of time should be? You know, 90 minutes would be a huge amount of times. I could start something at 12, then the next time I could start something would be 1:30. So what do you think we would measure time? How many units? How many minutes? We could do 1 minute, but that would be a lot of variables. Any thoughts? So if you do it 30 minutes, then you can only start things at 12, 12:30, 1, 1:30. 15, again, that's then only 12, 12, 15. I might go down to 5 minutes and do things in 5-minute increments. You would get some savings by not having as many variables, but still give you a little bit of freedom. There is some additional constraints that we want to get to later. Let me just clean on my kid. So there are some additional constraints that we'll get into later where some of the stuff will matter. But this is the first most natural constraint. You can't show more than 1 movie on a screen at a given time. So this was focused on a screen. So rather than focusing on a screen, what could we focus on next? So the first constraint was dealing with a screen. What's the next constraint? Okay, so that will come in terms of the revenue later. But we talked about we can't have a screen having multiple movies showing on it. So rather than looking at things from the screen's point of view, look at things from what point of view? So rather than looking at things from the point of view of the screen, what else do we have? So what's our product? What are we showing?
So we can look at it from the perspective.
So look at it from the perspective of a movie. So we can't have a screen having multiple movies. So from the point of view of a movie, what must be true? So you couldn't have one screen having 3 movies playing simultaneously. So if you put it from the point of view of the movie, one movie cannot,
Be on more than one screen.
one movie cannot be on more than one screen at
Are
the
we
same
saying,
time.
like movies is like a copy of a movie? Or-
Well, so if you want, if we have 2 copies of Phantom Menace, we'll have copy 1, copy 2. They'll be considered different movies, but they could compete with each other for demand. So it's simpler if we don't have repeated copies of a movie, because then you have to adjust the demand function.
Okay.
So cannot show the same movie on multiple screens at a given time. Okay, so now what's the for all? Before we had for all screens and for all time. And then we summed over movies. Now what do we have? We cannot show the same movie on multiple screens at a given time. So what are my for alls? For all movies, so for all M in, let's call it, too many, M, which will be 1, 2, ... M. For all what? Every movie
Every screen.
not every screen. I think we're going to sum over screens. We want to make sure it's showing on only one screen. So what should the for all be? For all time. So for all t in time, oh, I think I did it the other way. No, I did do it that way. For all t in time, 1, 2, ... t. So we want to make sure that each movie's on at most one screen. So we fixed M, we fixed the time, so we sum over all screens. I think I switched to blue, yes. So we sum over all screens, S goes from 1 to S, and we want to make sure that the movie is playing on only one screen. So how could it be playing on a screen? We could have started it at that time, or 1 unit before, or 2 units before, all the way up to its runtime -1. So we would then sum, tau goes from 0 to the runtime of movie M -1, X, screen S, movie M, and then time t minus tau. So this part over here, sees if playing movie M on screen S at time t. And actually, I just realized on this point, we actually didn't finish the constraint. We just wrote down this, sum is 1 if movie starts in enough time to be running. What do we want this to be? If we want to show at most 1 movie on a screen at a given time, what should the sum be? What should the constraint be? So this will tell you how many movies are running on screen S at time t. Less than or equal to 1. And so this is less than or equal to 1. So over here, we cannot show the same movie on multiple screens. What should this be less than or equal to? Also 1. These are hard constraints. These must be true. You can't be showing a movie on multiple screens. You can't have, 1 screen showing multiple movies. There are other constraints that would be soft. So let's try to think of a soft constraint. So these are desirable, but not necessary. So anybody think of what might be a desirable constraint?
Desire to show new movies.
So one is the desire to show new movies. So part of that could be in terms of choosing which movies we have, but just because they're in the list is maybe making sure that certain movies are played. So for example, could be show new movies. And maybe it could be a sum over time, sum over screen. And then maybe a sum of m equals 1 to maybe n to new x s m t is greater than or equal to some constant. So show some new movies. So that's a constraint. Other ones, and we'll talk a little bit about them later. How many start or end at similar times? Why might you not want to have too many movies starting at the same time? Yeah, lines will be too long. Yeah, this is the pretzel situation. Right? If you have everybody coming in at the same time, you're going to have a longer line to get in. What are you going to have to do? You might have to hire more workers. It's much better if you can spread the work out and have, this is why you don't want to do 15 minutes or 30 minutes as your timestamp, because you're going to have too much clustering. Why might you not want the movies to end at the same time? Clean up, or also just the crowds of everybody getting out. You might even break up the movie theater into different sectors and say, I can't have too many movies in the same sector ending at the same time because I want to control crowds. Another one, and this was the one that was really the killer, is have a movie start, say, every 20 minutes. And this was the killer. The manager didn't want anybody to just show up and have a long wait before a movie started. However, and again, this was being done, late 90s, early 2000s. The world had already started to change. And how many of you just go to a movie theater now without checking in advance what's happening? It doesn't happen anymore. And so people just adjust their schedules accordingly. So trying to make sure that we don't have any 20-minute gaps when no movies start, it's nice, but it might be worth taking a hit because people can adjust their schedules a little bit easier. Okay, if I know that the movie I want to do starts at 8:40, I'm going to adjust when do I want to go to dinner so that I can make the movie. A lot of good Seinfeld episodes on this. There is, however, a hard constraint that we've missed. Cannot start a movie if it is running on a screen. So I'm not going to do this. I want you to do this. Think about this and you email me, what do you think this constraint should be? So try to come up with, I can't start a movie if it's running on another screen. So when we looked at what was going on before, did we already handle this? Has this been incorporated in what we've already done? Or is this a fundamentally new constraint? And what I want you to get out of this is there are packages that do this. You don't have to write the code anymore. You can get packages. You can have, if you have a company, you can easily get a program that will solve problems like this. And what I want you to see is how flexible this subject is, that how many different problems we can solve. And then we'll see later, traveling salesman problem can be put into something like this. How many of you have ever played a game like Bridges or Free Flow? don't know if I have it on this. I do have it on this. Let me try. So how many of you have seen something like this, where you have to connect the stuff without going through, you can't cross the line. And so this one, I can come in like that, and then you've got to figure out how does green come in, and there's a way to do it so that you connect. You can set this up as a linear programming problem. And you can solve this using linear programming. So these are just things I want you to be thinking about. I want you to be thinking, I have a skill set. And this is not a skill set where you have to write the code to do it. There are packages. What you have to figure out how to do is how to set it up. How do you write down the constraints? That's the key part. And you have to figure out which constraints really matter. When I was young, the best part of Star Trek to me was the phasers and the photon torpedoes and the warp engines. As I got older, I realized the best part was the computer. Where you just say, computer, do the following. Working will take 6 hours. All right, let's go to the holodeck and have fun. And they just speak words, the computer self-programs and runs the analysis. This is the 21st century. That's what I want you to get out of this class, is to be aware we can handle a wide variety of problems. You already know enough to be very useful for stuff like this. All right, so this is a good place to stop for the day. So I will let you think about that.